The vast chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with a subdued murmur, the kind of noise that hovered when uncertainty lingered over the proceedings. High above, beams of silver light shone down through translucent panels, reflecting faintly off the polished obsidian floor. The air was cool, almost sterile, yet tinged with a faint metallic tang, perhaps from the omnipresent hum of energy coursing through the holographic displays suspended around the room. Representatives from countless worlds filled the semicircular rows of seats, their forms a kaleidoscope of diversity. Luminescent nebulons pulsed softly in shades of contemplative green, while the crystalline Zenui sat motionless, their jagged edges refracting the light like prisms. At the center of the chamber, a hologram flickered to life, displaying architectural schematics of human settlements on various council worlds. "They overbuild everything," scoffed Thar, a Marxi representative with mandibles clicking in a display of irritation. His rust-colored carapace gleamed under the chamber lights as he gestured toward the hologram with a clawed hand. "Reinforced walls for cultural centers? Emergency bunkers in civilian complexes? This is not security. It is paranoia." A faint ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. The Nebulon representative, shifting to a contemplative shade of indigo, added, "Even their ships carry redundancies far beyond what peaceful purposes require. Every design choice screams fear, or perhaps mistrust." Laughter, light and dismissive, echoed briefly. The consensus was clear. Humanity was an enigma wrapped in needless caution. Their technological advancements seemed impressive, but they lacked finesse. Their approach to everything, from engineering to diplomacy, felt excessive, almost crude. "They play strategic games with their children," added another voice, tinged with bemusement. The hologram shifted, displaying a human child teaching a young Marxi to play chess. "We thought it charming, even endearing, but now I wonder—" The speaker trailed off, his mandibles clicking softly, lost in thought. High Counselor Vrex leaned forward, his scales shifting to a deep contemplative blue. "Enough," he said, his voice a measured rumble. "Paranoia or not, humanity has proven its willingness to cooperate within the Council. Let us not belabor their eccentricities." Before anyone could respond, the chamber doors hissed open, and a new presence entered the room. The figure moved with a steady, purposeful gait, boots striking the floor in measured rhythm. The soft murmur of conversation faded as heads turned toward the newcomer. Captain Elias Vane, clad in the dark uniform of the United Earth Marine Corps, was an unassuming figure at first glance. His build was lean but taut, his movements precise without being stiff. There was no grandeur to his presence, no ostentation, and yet something about him seemed to draw the air from the room, leaving behind a silence heavy with expectation. The subtle shift in the chamber was palpable. It wasn't his appearance. There was nothing remarkable about his short-cropped brown hair or the faint scar tracing his jawline. It was the way his gray eyes scanned the room, unhurried but thorough, as if mapping every exit, every potential threat. It was the way his posture held a balance of ease and readiness, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "Captain Vane," Vrex said, his tone betraying no more than polite acknowledgement. "You are late." "Apologies, Counselor," Elias replied, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "The transport was delayed." His accent was neutral, clipped, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. He took his place at the far end of the chamber, standing rather than sitting, as if the act of relaxing would compromise some invisible line of defense. A few representatives exchanged glances. Subtle, but noticeable. "He observes everything," whispered Thar to the Nebulon beside him, whose luminescence shifted faintly in agreement. "A predator among prey." As the meeting resumed, Elias remained silent, his presence more a shadow than a participant. But his eyes missed nothing. He watched as the council debated trivial matters, their words flowing like water over smooth stones. He noted the shifts in posture, the flickers of light and color that betrayed emotions alien to him but unmistakable in their context. The hologram flickered again, this time displaying the layout of Proxima Center Station, where the Council's cultural exchange program was housed. The station's design mirrored humanity's influence, unnecessarily robust, with layered redundancies and fail-safes that drew quiet ridicule. Overcompensation, muttered a Zenwi elder, his crystalline form vibrating faintly. Their fear of collapse drives their designs. Elias spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. Better to have and not need, he said, than need and not have. All eyes turned to him. The simplicity of his words carried a weight that belied their brevity. The chamber grew quieter, the hum of machinery suddenly more pronounced. An odd philosophy, Vrex said, his tone measured, one that suggests an expectation of conflict. Elias met the counselor's gaze, unflinching. Preparedness isn't an expectation. It's a choice. The room bristled with unspoken tension. Elias let the moment linger before speaking again. You misunderstand us, he said, his tone steady but carrying an edge. You think our actions are driven by fear. They're not. They're driven by knowledge. Knowledge of what? Thar challenged, his mandibles clicking in irritation. Elias's gaze shifted to the hologram, where the chessboard still lingered. That the universe doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about your diplomacy or your ideals. It only cares about what you can do when it matters. The silence that followed was heavier than before, the kind that left no room for rebuttal. Vane's words were simple, but the implications were vast, unsettling. We play chess with our children, he continued, his voice soft but deliberate. Not because it's charming, but because it teaches them to think 5 moves ahead, to anticipate, to adapt. It's not a game, it's preparation. Thar shifted uncomfortably, his claws clicking against the edge of his seat. The Zenui elder's crystalline form dimmed, refracting light in a somber pattern. Even Vrex seemed momentarily lost in thought, his deep blue scales rippling faintly. We will discuss this further, Vrex said finally, his voice regaining its steady authority. For now, let us proceed. As the council turned back to its agenda, Elias remained at his post, a silent observer. But the air around him had changed. The easy dismissal of humanity as paranoid or overcautious had begun to erode, replaced by something heavier. Unease, curiosity, perhaps even fear. And Elias, standing alone at the edge of the chamber, let them wonder. The station's artificial dawn glowed faintly through the reinforced panels of Proxima Centaur's exchange center, casting muted shadows across the sprawling atrium. The air carried the faint hum of circulating oxygen, mingling with the sterile tang of cleaning agents. The center's architecture was a testament to the uneasy compromise between human design and alien aesthetics, a combination of angular precision and flowing organic curves, as if the structure couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Captain Elias Vane moved through the corridors with the same measured purpose that had drawn the council's attention. His boots struck the floor with a muted cadence, the sound blending with the distant chatter of multilingual voices and the faint whir of maintenance drones. Every detail of his surroundings passed through his mind like data points. The precise placement of surveillance cameras, the subtle patterns of foot traffic, the layout of exits and choke points. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. A subtle shift in the air alerted him to an approaching figure before the sound of soft footfalls reached his ears. Turning slightly, he saw Laris, a Nebulon liaison, her bioluminescent form glowing a contemplative shade of green. Her presence was quiet, unintrusive, like the faint glow of starlight against a void. Captain Vane, she said, her voice smooth with a melodic quality that belied the sharpness of her words. You've been quite the topic of conversation since yesterday's council session. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. I imagine I've left an impression. Laris's glow shifted to a faint amber, a Nebulon gesture of amusement. You're a difficult read, Captain. Most species here wear their emotions like an open book. You're different. Different can be useful, Elias replied, his tone flat but not unkind. It forces people to think. As they walked, Laris observed him closely, her bioluminescence flickering faintly. "Your chess analogy intrigued the council," she said, "but it also unsettled them. They wonder what else humanity considers preparation." Elias glanced at her, his gray eyes sharp but calm. "Let them wonder." Their conversation ended as they entered the Exchange Center's training facility, a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic sounds of drills and exercises. The air was tinged with the faint, acrid scent of sweat and ozone from the energy-based sparring equipment. Aliens of various species practiced in designated zones, their movements a blend of grace and awkwardness as they adapted to the techniques being taught. Elias's presence drew attention, but he ignored the curious glances as he stepped into the instructor's circle. Today's lesson was a self-defense class, a routine session aimed at fostering cooperation and camaraderie among the diverse species, or so the council believed. The moment Elias began the session, the atmosphere shifted. His movements were precise, economical, like a well-calibrated machine. He demonstrated holds, counters, and evasions with fluidity, his voice steady as he explained each technique. The aliens around him struggled to keep up, their limbs tangling as they attempted to mimic his actions. "Again," Elias said, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His gray eyes scanned the group, noting their flaws with clinical detachment. "Speed comes later. First, master control." Thar, the Marxi representative, observed from the sidelines, his mandibles clicking softly. Despite his earlier skepticism, he couldn't help but be drawn to the human's movements. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary flourish, only the cold efficiency of someone who knew what it meant to fight for survival. The turning point came when an accident disrupted the session. A Xenui trainee miscalculated a step, causing their crystalline appendage to shatter against the floor. The sudden sharp sound echoed through the chamber, and a cascade of razor-sharp shards shot toward the nearest group. Before anyone could react, Elias moved. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct. In a single seamless motion, he pushed two aliens out of harm's way, his arm sweeping through the air to deflect the largest shard. The crystal fragment stopped mere inches from the central nerve cluster of a young Marxi, held firmly between Elias's fingers. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the station's environmental systems. Elias straightened, his grip on the shard steady as he turned it over, examining its jagged edges. Then, without a word, he dropped it to the floor and stepped back. "You're faster than you look," Thar said, breaking the silence, though his tone carried no mockery this time. If anything, it held a grudging respect. "Standard training," Elias replied, his voice calm but firm. "Nothing extraordinary." The understatement hung in the air, but no one challenged it. For a moment, the room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of unspoken questions. Elias turned back to the group, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Control," he said, resuming the lesson as if nothing had happened. "Without it, speed is meaningless." Later that evening, as the station settled into the quiet hum of its artificial night, Laris found herself replaying the day's events in her mind. She sat in her quarters, her bioluminescence dimmed to a thoughtful blue, her fingers tracing patterns on the smooth surface of her datapad. Elias Vane was an enigma, one that both intrigued and unsettled her. His actions during the training session had been extraordinary, and yet he dismissed them as routine. His demeanor suggested discipline honed through experience, but what kind of experience shaped someone like him? The faint chime of her console broke her reverie, a message from Vrex. The High Counselor's words were brief but clear. "Keep observing the human. Report anything of note. He's hiding something, and I intend to find out what." Laris exhaled softly, her glow shifting to a muted amber. She didn't know if Elias was hiding anything, but she knew one thing for certain. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous thing of all. The sterile quiet of Proxima Centaur's High Council chamber was broken only by the faint hum of the central holo display. Its pale blue glow illuminated the curved room, casting faint shadows over the assembled alien representatives. The air carried an almost oppressive stillness, heavy with unspoken tension. Every seat was occupied, and every gaze was fixed on the solitary figure at the center of the floor. Captain Elias Vane stood unflinching beneath the council's scrutiny, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The faint scent of polished metal lingered around the podium, mingling with the cold, recycled air. Above him, the hollow display shifted to reveal a timeline of humanity's history, a cascade of images and records rendered in clinical precision. Vane's voice cut through the quiet, steady but carrying a weight that filled the space like an unrelenting tide. You've asked why humans build as we do, why we prepare the way we do. To answer, you need context. The display shifted, showing ancient ruins scorched by time, then replaced by the grainy black and white footage of tanks rolling across devastated landscapes. The scent of ozone from the hollow projector thickened in the chamber, an almost tactile reminder of the weight of history. For millennia, our species fought wars that consumed entire nations. Early conflicts had no rules, only victors and the ashes left behind. The room grew colder, or perhaps it was the growing stillness among the representatives. The Zenui elder leaned slightly forward, their crystalline form refracting the display's light in fractured rainbows. Thar's mandibles clicked faintly, betraying unease. Vane gestured, and the display zoomed in on images of World War II. Mushroom clouds rising above ruined cities, soldiers trudging through endless fields of destruction. His voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of generations. We learned the cost of unchecked violence. We learned that the line between war and slaughter is razor-thin. A faint ripple of color passed through the Nebulon representative, their form shifting to an alarmed violet. This destruction was inflicted by your own kind. Their tone trembled, their luminescent pulse erratic. Yes, Vane replied, meeting their gaze without hesitation. And we realized it couldn't continue. That's when we created the Geneva Conventions. The hollow display transitioned, showing the written articles of the conventions, stark and simple, against a white backdrop. Vane's voice softened, becoming almost introspective. Rules for war, guidelines for what is permissible and what crosses the line. Not because we lacked the ability to go further, but because we knew exactly how far we could go. The council chamber seemed to contract, the walls pressing inward with the collective weight of realization. A faint metallic tang sharpened the air, and even the steady hum of the hollow projector felt quieter, as though the room itself held its breath. Chemical weapons, biological agents, targeting civilians. Vane listed each with deliberate precision, his gray eyes scanning the room. These weren't abstract possibilities, they were realities, and we chose to forbid them. Thar's claws scraped against the armrest of his chair, his mandibles clicking in rapid agitation. You expect us to believe that your species, capable of this carnage, willingly restrained itself? Vane's expression didn't waver, but there was a faint shift in his tone, a subtle edge that hinted at something deeper. Restraint is a choice, he said, one we make every day. The hollow display shifted again, this time showing modern military exercises. Soldiers moved with methodical precision, their faces obscured, but their actions unmistakable. Explosions lit the screen, but the destruction was surgical, controlled, almost clinical in its execution. Our military philosophy isn't about avoiding war, Vane continued. It's about controlling it. Ethical warfare, if such a term can exist. The Zenui elders' crystalline form dimmed, their light refracting in muted patterns. Ethical warfare, they repeated, their tone heavy with disbelief. A paradox, surely. Not a paradox, Vane corrected. A necessity. The chamber fell silent again, the weight of his words settling like a shroud over the room. Outside, the faint vibration of a passing transport ship echoed through the walls, a distant reminder of the vast station beyond this insulated space. Laris, seated among the observers, watched Vane intently. Her bioluminescence had dimmed to a contemplative blue, her fingers tracing faint patterns against the edge of her seat. For the first time she felt the uncomfortable edge of doubt in her earlier assessments, in her understanding of the human before her. "What about those who break your rules?" The question came from Brex, his deep blue scales shifting slightly as he leaned forward. His tone was measured, but his gaze was sharp. Vane's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and for a moment the silence stretched unbearably thin. "When the rules are broken," he said finally, "we respond. Not to punish, but to ensure it doesn't happen again." His words were deliberate, his tone unwavering. And yet there was something beneath them, an undercurrent of memory, of something unspoken but heavy. The holodisplay transitioned again, showing scenes of post-conflict humanitarian efforts. Soldiers distributing food, evacuating civilians, rebuilding shattered towns. "We don't just fight wars," Vane said. "We repair what they destroy." The contrast was stark, almost jarring. The same hands that wielded precision strikes were shown mending broken lives. The same minds that calculated destruction were seen engineering hope. The juxtaposition hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. "We prepare," Vane said, his voice carrying an almost imperceptible tremor. "Not because we want war, but because we know it will come. And when it does, we fight not to dominate, but to protect." Thar shifted in his seat, his mandibles clicking faintly. "Protect what?" Vane's gaze swept the room, his expression harder now, sharper. "Everything that matters. Our people, our values, our future." The chamber seemed to contract again, the weight of the discussion pressing down like an unseen force. Laris's glow shifted faintly, her earlier curiosity replaced by something colder, heavier. As the meeting adjourned, Vane remained in the chamber, his figure silhouetted against the dimming holodisplay. The other representatives filed out in uneasy silence, their thoughts as fractured as the light reflecting off the polished floor. Laris lingered at the edge of the room, her bioluminescence flickering faintly. "Captain," she said softly. Vane turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes?" Her glow shifted to a pale amber, a faint gesture of uncertainty. "Why tell us this? Why reveal what you've hidden?" Vane's reply was simple, but it carried the weight of the conversation. "Because understanding is the first step to trust, and trust is what holds alliances together." Laris nodded slowly, but as she walked away, her thoughts swirled with doubt. Trust, she thought, was a fragile thing. And the more she learned about humanity, the more she wondered if it could withstand what they had yet to reveal. The faint hiss of oxygen recycling systems whispered through the dimly lit command room aboard the Resolute, a human military flagship stationed at the edge of Proxima Center. The air tasted sterile, with a metallic tang carried from the worn consoles lining the walls. Captain Elias Vane stood at the center of the room, the pale glow of a tactical hologram casting sharp angles across his face. Around him, officers worked in disciplined silence, their movements efficient, their focus unwavering. Outside, the void seemed deceptively calm, the faint shimmer of starlight obscuring the gathering storm. A distress signal had come in only hours ago, its message stark and urgent. A human colony in the Uranus sector had been struck by a rogue alien faction. A deliberate attack, not a raid. Civilians were dead. The settlement burned. Vane's gray eyes swept across the holographic map, his gaze tracing the trajectory of the alien fleet as it retreated into hive-controlled space. The lines and markers projected before him weren't abstractions. They were lives. Each red pulse was a ship. Each ship held warriors prepared to destroy everything in their path. "We don't have the resources for a prolonged engagement," said Commander Rhea Talon, her voice low but steady. Her short, dark hair was damp with sweat, and the smell of coffee and stress clung faintly to her. "They hit us knowing we'd hesitate. They want to draw us into hive territory." "They think hesitation is weakness," Vane replied, his tone colder than the room's artificial air. "It's not. It's precision." Talon frowned but didn't argue. Vane had a reputation for seeing angles others missed, for weaving plans from threads too thin for most to grasp. But the tension in her shoulders betrayed the unease she felt. They were walking into a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. "What's the objective?" she asked. Vane pointed to the map. We don't follow them into the depths of their space. That's what they expect. Instead, we take their forward base here. His finger moved to a faintly glowing outpost on the edge of Hive territory, and dismantle their logistical chain. Talon's brows furrowed. That's a fortified installation. Their defenses won't matter if we strike from above and below, Vane interrupted. His voice sharpened, each word cutting through the air like the edge of a blade. We don't overwhelm them. We isolate them, split their fleet into manageable pieces, force them to react instead of plan. The room buzzed with quiet urgency as officers began processing the strategy. The hum of consoles and the faint crackle of the hologram filled the space. The scent of ozone and overheated systems thickened, mingling with the faint rustle of uniforms as the crew moved with purpose. We'll deploy decoys to draw their forces away, Vane continued, his tone steady but unyielding. They'll think we're committing to a full assault. Meanwhile, we infiltrate with a precision strike team. Once their command structure collapses, the rest will follow. Talon nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of a console. And the civilians they've taken? Vane's jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. We'll get them out, alive. The planning unfolded with the meticulous precision of a chess match. Each piece was placed deliberately, every move calculated to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. Recon drones would chart the fastest routes through asteroid fields and debris-laden sectors. Covert ops teams would plant EMP devices to disable key defenses. The main fleet would engage in controlled skirmishes, creating just enough chaos to mask the infiltration. Hours passed in a blur of activity. The sterile hum of the command room became a backdrop to the quiet intensity of preparation. Vane moved between stations, his presence grounding the room like the gravity of a collapsing star. Officers worked tirelessly, their focus absolute, their movements synchronized. By the time the fleet departed, the crew moved as one. Every fighter pilot, every engineer, every soldier knew their role. The Resolute's engines roared to life, their vibrations thrumming through the hull like the heartbeat of a leviathan awakening. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. The Hive fleet had responded exactly as predicted, splitting their forces to intercept the decoy ships. Explosions bloomed in the void like fleeting suns, casting stark shadows over the skirmish. The acrid smell of overheated metal filled the corridors of the Resolute as its crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship operational. Infiltration teams moved in silence, their cloaked ships slipping through the chaos like shadows through water. The air inside their vessels was cold, heavy with the recycled breath of soldiers who knew their lives hinged on the success of the plan. Each team member carried the weight of the mission with stoic resolve. Vane's voice crackled over the comms, his tone calm but commanding. Team Alpha, proceed to the primary target. Disable their long-range comms first. Team Beta, secure the hostages. Minimal noise. Copy that, came the responses, crisp and precise. Inside the Hive outpost, the corridors were a stark contrast to the void outside. Bioorganic walls pulsed faintly, their surfaces glistening with a faint, sickly sheen. The air was humid, carrying a sharp, acrid smell that clung to the skin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of alien machinery. Team Alpha moved with practiced efficiency, their boots barely making a sound against the organic floor. At the front of the formation, Sergeant Lorne gestured for a halt, his gloved hand illuminated faintly by the glow of his wrist-mounted scanner. "Motion ahead," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "2 guards, stationary." "Take them out," Vane's voice replied, unflinching. The team moved as one, their actions precise and lethal. The guards fell without a sound, their biomechanical forms crumpling to the floor. The scent of burnt circuitry mixed with the humid air, a faint but distinct reminder of the stakes. Meanwhile, Team Beta reached the hostages, civilians huddled in a dark chamber, their faces pale and drawn. The air was thick with the smell of fear and the metallic tang of blood. Beta's leader, Lieutenant Harker, moved quickly, his voice low but firm. "We're getting you out. Stay close, stay quiet." The extraction was swift, but tension coiled tighter with each passing second. Outside, the Hive forces were beginning to realize the deception. Alarms blared, their shrill tones reverberating through the station like a physical force. Vane's voice cut through the noise. "Teams, status?" "Comms down," Alpha reported, moving to secondary objective. "Hostages secure," Beta confirmed, en route to extraction point. The plan unfolded perfectly, but perfection came at a cost. As the teams converged for extraction, the Hive launched a desperate counterattack. The air filled with the sound of plasma fire and the acrid scent of burning metal. Soldiers moved like ghosts through the chaos, their movements synchronized, their resolve unshaken. Vane coordinated the assault from the Resolute's bridge, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. Each command was a lifeline, pulling the teams closer to safety. When the final ship docked, the crew erupted into cheers, their relief palpable. But Vane remained still, his eyes scanning the tactical display. The Hive outpost was reduced to a lifeless husk, its defenses shattered, its fleet in disarray. "We're not done," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the battles yet to come. This was a message, and they heard it loud and clear. The room fell silent, the reality of his words sinking in. Victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The command room of the Resolute was subdued, its air thick with the lingering scent of scorched circuits and the faint metallic tang of cooling machinery. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, a low, steady rhythm beneath the distant echoes of hurried footsteps and faint chatter. Captain Elias Vane stood at the center, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on the holographic display that hovered before him. The mission had succeeded. The Hive outpost was destroyed, its fleet fractured, its control over the sector irrevocably weakened. But the cost lingered in the quiet faces of his crew, in the tension etched into the lines of Commander Rhea Talon's expression as she approached. "Casualty reports are coming in," Talon said, her voice low but steady. She handed Vane a datapad, the screen casting a pale glow that highlighted her tired eyes. 37 dead, another 58 injured, and the hostages. They'll need time." Vane took the pad without a word, his gray eyes scanning the numbers. The weight of each loss settled on him like the silent press of gravity. He set the pad aside and turned back to the display. The remnants of the Hive fleet were regrouping at a distant stronghold deeper in their territory. A new threat was already forming on the horizon. "They'll retaliate," Talon said. "They always do." "Let them," Vane replied, his voice calm but carrying a blade's edge. "This time we'll be ready." The words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken promise of what was to come. Around them, the room buzzed with subdued activity. Officers moved between consoles, their voices hushed but purposeful. The faint smell of burnt ozone lingered, a reminder of the battles fought only hours ago. Suddenly the room fell quiet as a new figure entered. Laris, the Nebulan liaison, glided forward, her bioluminescent form pulsing faintly with hues of indigo and amber. Her presence was understated, almost ethereal, but her gaze held a sharpness that cut through the room's stillness. "Captain Vane," she began, her tone measured, "the Council is convening an emergency session. They've requested your presence." Vane turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I take it they want answers." "They want to understand," Laris replied. "But understanding and accepting are not the same." The council chamber was colder than Vane remembered, the sterile air sharp against his skin. The faint hum of the holographic system seemed louder in the tense silence that filled the room. Around him, the alien representatives sat in their semicircular rows, their forms illuminated by the pale blue light of the central display. At the heart of the chamber, the holo display projected a three-dimensional model of the Hive's stronghold. The structure loomed like a grotesque monolith, its organic walls pulsating faintly as if alive. The image rotated slowly, casting flickering shadows across the polished floor. High Counselor Vrex spoke first, his deep blue scales shimmering with an unreadable intensity. "Captain Vane, your actions have left us with more questions than answers. The destruction of the Hive outpost was efficient, but the methods employed—" He paused, his gaze sharp. "They have raised concerns." "Concerns about what?" Vane asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. Vrex gestured toward the display. Your precision, your strategy, your willingness to inflict such damage. It forces us to ask, what are humans truly capable of when they abandon restraint? The chamber murmured with agreement, faint clicks and hums filling the air. Vane let the noise settle before speaking. What we're capable of is irrelevant, he said, his tone measured. What matters is what we choose to do. Choice, repeated Thar, his mandibles clicking softly. You speak of restraint, yet your actions suggest otherwise. Vane stepped forward, his figure illuminated by the display's glow. Restraint isn't the absence of action, it's the control of it. Every move we made, every strike we delivered, was calculated to minimize collateral damage and civilian loss. Can any of you say the same about the Hive? The chamber fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down like a palpable force. Vane's gaze swept the room, his gray eyes sharp as steel. You misunderstand us because you assume our rules exist to limit our power. They don't. They exist to control it. Vrex leaned forward slightly, his gaze unyielding. And what happens when those rules are broken? Vane's voice dropped, the edges of his words cutting through the silence like shards of glass. Then we remind ourselves why they exist. The display shifted, showing historical footage of Earth's wars, its atrocities, its victories. Images of ruined cities, devastated landscapes, and soldiers standing amidst the wreckage filled the room. The faint hum of the hollow projector was the only sound, the images speaking louder than words. We learned these lessons the hard way, Vane said, his tone heavy with the weight of history. Not because we wanted to, but because we had no choice. War doesn't care about morality. It doesn't care about ideals. It only cares about survival. Laris's bioluminescence dimmed to a contemplative blue, her gaze fixed on the images. You speak of survival as if it justifies everything, she said softly. But at what cost? Vane turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. The cost is always too high. That's why we fight the way we do. Not to win at any price, but to ensure there's something worth winning. The chamber grew colder, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Vrex's scales shifted faintly, his voice measured as he spoke. And yet your actions suggest a willingness to go further than others. Because we have to, Vane replied, his voice rising with conviction. Every battle, every decision, is a calculation. A balance between what we can do and what we must. He stepped closer to the display, his figure casting a long shadow across the chamber. The Hive doesn't respect your treaties, your diplomacy, your restraint. They see it as weakness. But when they see us, they see something else. They see what happens when restraint is paired with purpose. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Vane turned back to the assembly, his gaze unwavering. You asked what humans are capable of when we abandon restraint. The answer is simple. We don't. Because if we did, there would be nothing left. The chamber erupted in murmurs, a cacophony of voices filled with awe, fear, and something else, understanding. Vane remained silent, his presence commanding the room as the noise gradually subsided. In the quiet that followed, Vrex spoke again, his tone softer, but no less firm. Captain Vane, your words carry weight, but so do your actions. The Council will deliberate on what they mean for our alliance. Vane nodded, his expression unreadable. Deliberate all you want. Just remember, restraint is a choice, and it's one we make every day. As he turned to leave, the chamber remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the still air. Laris watched him go, her glow shifting to a faint amber. She didn't know what the Council would decide, but she knew one thing. Humanity's strength wasn't in its capacity for violence. It was in its ability to hold that capacity in check, to wield it with purpose and control. And that, she realized, was far more terrifying and far more inspiring than anything she could have imagined. Vane turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. The cost is always too high. That's why we fight the way we do. Not to win at any price, but to ensure there's something worth winning. The chamber grew colder, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Vrex's scales shifted faintly, his voice measured as he spoke. And yet your actions suggest a willingness to go further than others. Because we have to, Vane replied, his voice rising with conviction. Every battle, every decision, is a calculation. A balance between what we can do and what we must. He stepped closer to the display, his figure casting a long shadow across the chamber. The Hive doesn't respect your treaties, your diplomacy, your restraint. They see it as weakness. But when they see us, they see something else. They see what happens when restraint is paired with purpose. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Vane turned back to the assembly, his gaze unwavering. You asked what humans are capable of when we abandon restraint. The answer is simple. We don't. Because if we did, there would be nothing left. The chamber erupted in murmurs, a cacophony of voices filled with awe, fear, and something else, understanding. Vane remained silent, his presence commanding the room as the noise gradually subsided. In the quiet that followed, Vrex spoke again, his tone softer, but no less firm. Captain Vane, your words carry weight, but so do your actions. The Council will deliberate on what they mean for our alliance. Vane nodded, his expression unreadable. Deliberate all you want. Just remember, restraint is a choice, and it's one we make every day. As he turned to leave, the chamber remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the still air. Laris watched him go, her glow shifting to a faint amber. She didn't know what the Council would decide, but she knew one thing. Humanity's strength wasn't in its capacity for violence. It was in its ability to hold that capacity in check, to wield it with purpose and control. And that, she realized, was far more terrifying and far more inspiring than anything she could have imagined.